My name is Hannah Whitfield. I'm 29, and for days after I gave birth to my daughter, my mother-in-law stood in the doorway of the house I'd lived in for 3 years and told me there was no room for a useless wife anymore. What she didn't know, standing in that doorway with my hospital bag still by the stairs, was that the house behind her, the one she was ordering me out of, had been in my name alone for the past 14 months, and that I had exactly one phone call left to make before her whole family found that out in the worst possible way. Let me back up. Because you need to understand the house before you understand what happened in that doorway. I met my husband, Caleb Whitfield, -1 years ago at a mutual friend's barbecue in Asheville, North Carolina. Back when I was 23 and finishing my nursing degree, and he was 26 and working for his father's vat company. The kind of family business that had quietly supported 3 generations of Whitfields in the same small town without ever making anyone particularly rich. Just comfortable in that specific, stubborn, small-town way. Caleb was kind in the ordinary, unremarkable way that doesn't photograph well, but wears well over years. He remembered how I took my coffee after the second time we met. He never once made me feel small for being the one with student debt, while his family had a paid-off house and a business with his name already halfway attached to it. We got married 2 years later, and for the first 18 months of our marriage we rented a small apartment above a hardware store downtown, saving carefully while Caleb's parents, Diane and Gerald, made increasingly frequent, increasingly pointed comments about how a real Whitfield family lives on Whitfield land, a phrase I heard so many times at Sunday dinners that I could recite it in Diane's exact cadence before she'd even finished her wine. The house came up almost 3 years ago now. A modest 3-bedroom rancher onto acres at the edge of the Whitfield family's original property. Land that had been in Caleb's family for 4 generations. Though this particular house itself had been built and sold off to a neighbor decades back before the family bought the parcel back at auction after that neighbor passed. Gerald and Diane offered it to us as what they called a wedding gift. Sort of, a late one. Caleb and I would live there. And eventually, they said, it would simply become ours outright once we'd proven ourselves as a family. A phrase that should have concerned me a great deal more than it did at the time. I want to be honest that I did notice, even then, a strange insistence from Diane that the paperwork just needed to go through her lawyer first, for tax reasons, and that 18 months would pass with us living in that house, paying the utilities and doing the repairs and treating it fully as our own home, before any actual deed transfer happened at all. What changed everything, in a way none of us could have predicted, was my own mother. A detail I don't think Diane ever fully processed the significance of until it was much too late for her to do anything about it. My mother, Patricia, had spent 31 years as a paralegal at a small real estate law firm in the next county over, the unglamorous, unnoticed kind of career that nonetheless means she has read approximately 4,000 and more property deeds in her lifetime than the average person ever will. When I mentioned, almost in passing at a Sunday dinner about 14 months ago, that Gerald's lawyers still hadn't finalized the transfer of the house into the family name, my mother asked one quiet question that would end up mattering more than anything else in this entire story. Whose name, exactly, honey? Yours and Caleb's, or just Gerald and Diane's trust? I didn't know. I called Gerald's lawyer's office the following week to ask, mostly to satisfy my mother's curiosity more than any suspicion of my own, and the answer I got back, relayed through a somewhat flustered paralegal who clearly hadn't expected the question, was that the property was still, in fact, titled entirely in Diane's name alone, inside a family trust that named Caleb as a future beneficiary but gave me, his wife, no legal standing in the house whatsoever. Despite 3 years of us living there as our primary residence and paying for every single repair ourselves, my mother, when I told her this, went very quiet in the specific way she does when she's already 3 steps ahead of a conversation everyone else is still catching up to, and said, Hannah, I want you to listen to me very carefully, because I've seen exactly this situation go very badly for women I used to process paperwork for. What my mother explained to me over the following weeks, patiently, the way she'd once explained things to confused first-time home buyers at her firm, was this: under North Carolina law, and under most states' laws generally, A spouse living in a marital residence, even one not directly in their name, generally accumulates certain protections and equitable claims over time, especially once they've contributed financially and physically to the property's maintenance and improvement, protections that get dramatically stronger and clearer. However, if your name is actually, literally on the deed, rather than relying on the much murkier, much more expensive to prove territory of equitable contribution claims that could take years and thousands of dollars in legal fees to establish if a marriage ever fell apart or a family relationship ever soured. My mother's specific advice, delivered over coffee at her kitchen table on a Tuesday I still remember clearly, was blunt: get your name on that deed, properly, now, while everyone's still being nice to each other. Because the nice version of this family is not going to be the version you're dealing with if anything ever goes wrong. Trust me, I've read the paperwork on 100 families exactly like this one. I brought it up with Caleb that same week. Carefully, the way you bring up something you already suspect your spouse's family won't want to hear. Caleb, to his credit, agreed immediately and without any defensiveness. He'd always been more clear-eyed about his mother's particular way of holding on to control through paperwork and technicalities than I think even he fully admitted to himself most days. He brought it up with his parents at the next Sunday dinner, framing it simply as wanting to get the deeds sorted properly since we've been here 3 years now, and Gerald, who I genuinely believe meant well in this specific instance, agreed readily enough. While Diane's face did something complicated and controlled that I filed away at the time and understood completely, in hindsight. Only much later. What actually happened with the paperwork, though, is the detail that ended up mattering more than anything else in this whole story. And it happened almost by accident, in the specific way that important things sometimes do. Diane's family lawyer, an older man named Harlan Voss who'd handled Whitfield family business for over 2 decades, was in the process of retiring, and the associate who actually drew up the new deed transfer paperwork that spring was a much younger attorney named Priyaner, newly hired, unfamiliar yet with the particular unspoken family politics of a client she'd inherited from her retiring boss. When Gerald called Voss's office to request adding Hannah properly to the property, the instruction that actually reached Priyaner's desk, transcribed by a receptionist working from a hurried phone message, was simply to transfer the Cedar Ridge property into the younger Whitfield's names as previously discussed, a note that, crucially, did not specify Caleb's name alone. The way Diane had apparently always privately intended it to read, Priyaner, doing exactly what any competent young attorney would do with an ambiguous instruction on a married couple's primary residence, drew up the deed in both Caleb's and my names jointly, as tenants by the entirety, which under North Carolina law is actually the strongest possible form of joint ownership a married couple can hold, the kind that can't be unilaterally severed by one spouse, or, more importantly for what came later, by anyone outside the marriage at all. The paperwork went through Gerald's signature as the outgoing trustee, through the county recorder's office, filed and finalized and entirely legal. 14 months before the morning my mother-in-law would stand in that doorway and tell me there was no room in her house for a useless wife anymore. I want to be honest that I didn't fully register at the time exactly how significant this clerical accident actually was. Caleb and I both signed where we were told to sign at a brief meeting at the lawyer's office, thanked everyone, and went back to our lives, genuinely believing, the way you believe unremarkable administrative tasks are unremarkable, that this was simply a formality catching the paperwork up to a reality we'd already been living for 3 years. Diane, for her part, never once mentioned the deed again after that meeting. And in hindsight, I understand now that this was very likely because she genuinely believed, based on what she'd requested from Harlan Voss's office months earlier, that the property had been transferred into Caleb's name alone, the way she'd always privately planned, and that whatever error had actually occurred in her lawyer's office had simply never been caught by anyone, including her, in the 14 months since the pregnancy. When it came 6 months later, changed the temperature of everything in the Whitfield family in ways I hadn't fully anticipated, mostly for the better at first. Diane, who had been quietly, persistently cool toward me for 3 years in the specific way mothers-in-law can be cool without ever saying a single actionable unkind word. Suddenly warmed considerably once she understood a grandchild, the first on that side of the family, was actually coming. She started showing up with baby clothes, with unsolicited opinions about nursery colors, with the particular intensity of a woman who had clearly been waiting for this exact role for a long time and intended to occupy it fully. I told myself, during those months, that perhaps this was the actual turning point in our relationship, that a shared grandchild would finally dissolve whatever quiet Cold War had existed underneath 3 years of technically polite Sunday dinners. I gave birth to our daughter, Eloise, on a Thursday in March. After 19 hours of labor that ended unplanned in an emergency C-section after Eloise's heart rate dropped during the final stage of pushing. The surgery went fine, in the end, but I came out of it exhausted in a way that went beyond ordinary new parent exhaustion genuinely. Physically depleted, still on pain medication. Barely able to walk from the bed to the bathroom without Caleb's arm under mine for the better part of the first week home. Caleb, to his enormous credit, took 4 weeks off from his father's business to be home with me and Eloise, cooking what he could, handling nighttime feedings so I could sleep in longer stretches, doing the kind of quiet, unglamorous labor that doesn't get remarked on nearly as much as it should in most families. Diane came by on the second day we were home, ostensibly to help, and it was during that visit that I first noticed something had shifted in her again, in a direction I didn't yet have language for. She held Eloise for nearly 2 hours while I slept, which felt, at the time, like exactly the kind of grandmotherly devotion I'd hoped for. But she also, in that same visit, made 3 separate comments that I filed away without quite processing their weight yet. A comment about how some women just bounce back faster than others when I mentioned how sore I still was. A comment about how the house could really use a deep clean before too many visitors come through, delivered while looking pointedly at a laundry basket I had no physical capacity to deal with 4 days after major abdominal surgery. And a third comment, the one that in hindsight should have told me everything, about how it's a good thing this is a real family house. So Eloise will always have somewhere stable to come back to, no matter what happens between grown-ups. I didn't understand, on day 2, that Diane had spent the better part of the previous week discovering, finally, 14 months after the fact, exactly whose name was actually on that deed. I found out what Diane had discovered, and what she decided to do about it, on day 4, in a way that still feels almost unreal when I tell it out loud. The way genuinely surreal moments in your own life sometimes do even years later. Caleb had gone into the office that morning for what he'd promised would be 2 hours, tops, to handle a payroll issue his father genuinely couldn't sort out without him. Since Gerald had never quite mastered the accounting software the business had switched to the year before, I was still moving carefully, still on a walker's pace, even inside my own house, for days post-surgery, when I heard a car in the driveway earlier than I expected and looked out to see Diane's silver sedan. And, parked behind it, a car I didn't recognize at all. Diane came in without knocking, which wasn't unusual for her, but she came in that day with a folder tucked under her arm and an expression I'd genuinely never seen on her face before. Not her usual controlled, faintly disapproving pleasantness, but something harder, more decided. The expression of a woman who has already made up her mind about something and is simply working through the logistics of delivering it. Behind her, a woman I didn't recognize stood in the doorway for a moment before Diane introduced her, almost as an afterthought, as Marjorie. From the property management side of things, a phrase that meant nothing to me in the moment and would come to mean a great deal within the next 10 minutes. "Hannah," Diane said, setting the folder down on my own kitchen counter without being asked. "I think it's time we talked honestly about the living situation here. Now that the baby's arrived and things are going to be changing for everyone." I was holding Eloise at the time, 4 days old, asleep against my chest in the specific boneless way newborn sleep. And I remember very clearly the strange sensation of trying to process what Diane was saying while also being acutely aware of how much my incision hurt every time I shifted my weight to stay standing. I asked her what she meant by the living situation, genuinely confused. still operating under the assumption that whatever this was, it was some kind of misunderstanding that a few clarifying sentences would resolve. What Diane said next, I have turned over in my mind more times than I can count in the weeks since, trying to understand exactly how a woman who had held my newborn daughter with apparent tenderness 2 days earlier could say it with the flat, rehearsed calm she used. Caleb's father and I have been discussing it, and honestly, Hannah, we think it's best for everyone if you and the baby move back in with your own mother for a while, at least until things get sorted. This house needs to function as a real family home again, and frankly, we've had concerns for some time now about whether you're really equipped to keep up with everything a home like this requires. There's simply no room here right now for her, and this is the exact phrase, the one I will genuinely never forget for the rest of my life. A useless wife who can't even manage her own laundry. I want to tell you I had some perfectly composed, devastating response ready in that moment, the way people always seem to in the versions of these stories you read online. I didn't. I stood there, for days post-C-section, holding my sleeping daughter. And I said, stupidly, this is my house too. Diane, which came out sounding far less certain than I actually felt. Mostly because my body was simply exhausted past the point of producing much conviction in my own voice. Diane's expression didn't change at all. Sweetheart, she said, in a tone that somehow managed to be both gentle and utterly dismissive at once. I understand you and Caleb have lived here, but this house belongs to this family. It always has. I think in all the exhaustion of the last few days, you may just be a little confused about what's actually yours and what isn't. Marjorie's just here to help us start getting things organized for the transition. That's all. Nothing needs to happen today. Obviously, we're not monsters. But I do need you to understand that this arrangement, going forward, isn't sustainable. Not with everything I've been hearing. I asked her what exactly she'd been hearing, and about what. And Diane's answer told me everything I needed to know about the previous 4 days in that family, in a way that made my stomach drop even through the fog of pain medication and sleep deprivation. Gerald, apparently, had mentioned to her, offhandedly, the way men in that family tended to mention things that later turned into decisions that Caleb had told him during a stressed moment in the delivery room waiting area. Something about how hard the last few months of pregnancy had been on our finances, on our marriage, on me generally, the ordinary, unremarkable stress of a difficult final trimester that every couple goes through in one form or another. Diane had apparently taken this offhand comment, filtered through Gerald, filtered again through whatever anxieties she'd been quietly nursing about my place in this family for 3 years, and constructed from it an entire narrative in which I was somehow failing at the basic functions of wife and mother for days after major surgery, in a house I had spent 3 years actually maintaining, cooking in, repairing, and paying utilities for. What I didn't yet understand, standing in my kitchen holding Eloise while Marjorie hovered awkwardly by the door with a clipboard I still hadn't fully registered the significance of, was that Diane had spent the previous week, the same week I'd been recovering from surgery, learning to breastfeed, surviving on 3-hour sleep intervals, quietly reaching out to a property management contact, an old friend of hers who ran rental listings on the side, to begin exploring options for the Cedar Ridge property, under the apparent assumption, based on whatever her lawyer's office had told her 14 months earlier, that the house remained solely in the family trust, hers to redirect however she saw fit. Regardless of what Caleb or I actually wanted, I asked Marjorie directly what exactly she was there to help organize, mostly because some instinct in me, even exhausted and in pain, understood that whatever was actually happening in my kitchen was bigger than a single uncomfortable family conversation. Marjorie, to her credit, looked genuinely uncomfortable herself, glancing at Diane before answering, and said, carefully, that she'd been asked to do a walkthrough and get a sense of the property's rental readiness, in case the family decided to explore leasing it out to a tenant while things got settled. A tenant in the house I had lived in for 3 years, for days after giving birth in it, while I was apparently expected to simply relocate myself and a newborn to my mother's spare bedroom on short notice, based on a rumour filtered through my father-in-law about a stressed comment my exhausted husband had made in a hospital waiting room. I did not, in that moment, tell Diane about the deed. I want to be honest about why, because I've asked myself the same question many times since. It would have been so easy, so immediately satisfying, to simply say the words out loud right there in my kitchen and watch her face change. But some instinct, sharper than my exhaustion, some quiet echo of my mother's voice from that Tuesday morning conversation over coffee 14 months earlier, told me that the actual power in that moment came from information Diane didn't yet have. And that the second I said those words out loud, casually, in anger, in my own kitchen with a strange property manager standing by my door, I would lose whatever advantage that ignorance currently gave me. So instead, I did something that surprised even myself in the moment. I asked Diane, as calmly as for days of sleep deprivation and abdominal surgery would allow, to please leave and to take Marjorie with her, and told her that Caleb and I would discuss the living situation as a married couple, together, without an audience, and that nothing about the house was going to be decided that afternoon by anyone standing in my kitchen holding a clipboard. Diane's face, for just a second, showed something like genuine surprise. I don't think, in 3 years of careful, controlled Sunday dinners, she had ever once heard me refuse her anything directly, and I don't think she quite knew what to do with it. She recovered quickly, though, gathering her folder back under her arm with a tight, thin smile, and said, on her way out the door, the sentence that I would spend the following hour turning over and over in my mind while I waited for Caleb to get home. I think you'll find, sweetheart, that this decision isn't really up to you. It never really was. I called my mother the second Diane's car pulled out of the driveway, still holding Eloise, my hands shaking in a way that had nothing to do with the pain medication anymore. My mother listened to the entire story without interrupting once, the way she does when she's already working through a legal problem 3 steps ahead of the conversation. And when I finished, she asked me one question. Quietly, the same careful, precise tone she'd used 14 months earlier at her kitchen table. Hannah, do you still have a copy of that deed? The actual recorded one from the county, not just the lawyer's paperwork? I did. It was in a fireproof folder in the hall closet, exactly where Caleb had filed it 14 months earlier after we'd both signed at Holland-Voss's office. A piece of paper neither of us had looked at again since. The way you don't look again at a smoke detector once you know it's installed and working. My mother told me to get it out, to photograph every page clearly, and to wait for Caleb to get home before doing anything else at all, because, as she put it, with the particular flat calm of 31 years spent reading property law paperwork professionally, Hannah, honey, I don't think your mother-in-law has any idea what she actually put her own signature on 14 months ago. And I think when she finds out, this is going to go very, very differently than she's currently expecting. Caleb got home 40 minutes later to find me sitting at the kitchen table with Eloise asleep in her bassinet beside me, and the deed spread out in front of me. And the look on his face when I told him what had happened, what his own mother had said, what she'd arranged. The property manager standing in our doorway with a clipboard while I was still for days out from surgery is a look I hope I never have to see on my husband's face again. A specific, quiet kind of fury that took him a long moment to even find words for. She thinks the house is hers, he said finally. Not a question. I told him yes, that seemed to be exactly what she thought, and that she had apparently believed it for 14 months. Ever since a phone call to Holland-Voss's office that neither of us had thought twice about at the time. Caleb sat down across from me, picked up the deed, read it slowly. The way you read something you already technically know, but are only now actually absorbing the full weight of. And then looked up at me with an expression I hadn't quite seen from him before either. Something steadier than the anger. Something closer to resolve. Okay, he said. Then I think it's time my mother found out exactly whose signature is actually on this piece of paper. But I don't think we tell her over the phone. I think we tell her the same way she tried to tell you, in person, with everyone in the room. So there's no room left afterward for her to pretend this went differently than it did. We made a plan that night. The two of us, sitting at that kitchen table with our 4-day-old daughter asleep beside us. And it is the plan that led, 3 weeks later, to the phone call my mother-in-law made to me at 5:45 on a Tuesday morning. In tears, the call I told you about at the very beginning of this story, we didn't rush it. That was the first decision Caleb and I made together at that kitchen table. And looking back, I think it was the right one. Even though every instinct I had in the days immediately following Diane's visit wanted to call her back that same afternoon and simply say the words out loud. Caleb, though, had grown up watching his mother operate for 30 years. And he understood something about her that I, only 3 years married into the family, was still learning. Diane Whitfield did not respond well to information delivered in anger. In private, where she could simply reframe it later to whoever wasn't in the room, she responded to consequences delivered publicly. In front of the same audience she'd always used to control the narrative of our family. So we waited 3 weeks, which felt, in the moment, like an eternity of quiet tension every time Diane called to check in on Eloise. Her voice warm and grandmotherly on the phone in a way that made my skin crawl slightly every single time, knowing what I now knew about the conversation still coming. During those 3 weeks, Caleb did 2 things carefully and deliberately. First, he asked his father, Gerald, to come by the house alone one evening, without Diane, ostensibly just to see the baby. Gerald had said almost nothing during the doorway incident. He hadn't been there. In fact, it had been entirely Diane's initiative with the property manager, and Caleb wanted to understand exactly how much his father actually knew, and whether Gerald himself believed the house belonged solely to the family trust. That conversation, which Caleb recounted to me afterward almost word for word, told us everything we needed to know about how badly Diane's version of events had diverged from reality. Gerald, holding Eloise on our porch that evening, mentioned, almost as small talk, that he was glad the renting the place out idea had cooled down, because he'd never been entirely comfortable with it, though he understood his wife's concerns about the marriage. When Caleb asked him directly whose name was on the deed, Gerald answered without hesitation, entirely confident, entirely wrong. It's in your name, son. We sorted that out with Harlan a while back, remember? Your mother wanted it settled properly before the baby came, Gerald. It turned out, genuinely believed the deed named Caleb alone. Exactly the outcome Diane had always intended, and had no idea at all that a receptionist's hurried phone transcription over a year earlier had quietly changed the entire trajectory of what was actually legally true. The second thing Caleb did, during those 3 weeks, was call Harlan Bourse's office directly, not to alert anyone to the actual state of the paperwork, but simply to request a certified copy of the recorded deed sent directly to us, framed as routine record keeping for our own files now that we had a new baby and wanted everything organized. The certified copy arrived within a week, official county seal and all, removing any possible ambiguity or claim later that our own copy had been altered or misunderstood. My mother, when I told her we'd requested it, said simply, "Good girl," in the specific tone she reserves for momas when a case is airtight before it's even been argued. We planned the actual family dinner for a Sunday. The same day of the week, the Whitfields had gathered for 3 years of increasingly loaded conversations about real family land, and Caleb was the one who suggested, deliberately, that we hosted at our house instead of his parents', for the first time in 3 years. Diane, when Caleb called to propose it, sounded genuinely pleased, taking it, I think, as a sign that we were finally coming around to her plan, that hosting the dinner ourselves was some kind of quiet acquiescence to the idea that decisions about the family home ultimately ran through her. She offered to bring a casserole. She asked, with what I now recognize as calculated casualness, whether we'd given any more thought to the living situation, and Caleb told her only that we had a lot to talk about, and that he wanted the whole family there, including his father and his sister Bree, who lived 40 minutes away and rarely made it to these Sunday dinners anymore since her own divorce 2 years earlier. We didn't rush it. That was the first decision Caleb and I made together at that kitchen table. And looking back, I think it was the right one. Even though every instinct I had in the days immediately following Diane's visit wanted to call her back that same afternoon and simply say the words out loud. Caleb, though, had grown up watching his mother operate for 30 years, and he understood something about her that I, only 3 years married into the family, was still learning. Diane Whitfield did not respond well to information delivered in anger. In private, where she could simply reframe it later to whoever wasn't in the room, She responded to consequences delivered publicly. In front of the same audience she'd always used to control the narrative of our family. So we waited 3 weeks, which felt, in the moment, like an eternity of quiet tension every time Diane called to check in on Eloise. Her voice warm and grandmotherly on the phone in a way that made my skin crawl slightly every single time, knowing what I now knew about the conversation still coming. During those 3 weeks, Caleb did 2 things carefully and deliberately. First, he asked his father, Gerald, to come by the house alone one evening, without Diane, ostensibly just to see the baby. Gerald had said almost nothing during the doorway in Sutton. He hadn't been there. In fact, it had been entirely Diane's initiative with the property manager, and Caleb wanted to understand exactly how much his father actually knew, and whether Gerald himself believed the house belonged solely to the family trust. That conversation, which Caleb recounted to me afterward almost word for word, told us everything we needed to know about how badly Diane's version of events had diverged from reality. Gerald, holding Eloise on our porch that evening, mentioned, almost as small talk, that he was glad the renting the place out idea had cooled down, because he'd never been entirely comfortable with it, though he understood his wife's concerns about the marriage. When Caleb asked him directly whose name was on the deed, Gerald answered without hesitation, entirely confident, entirely wrong. "It's in your name, son. We sorted that out with Harlan a while back, remember? Your mother wanted it settled properly before the baby came, Gerald." It turned out, genuinely believed the deed named Caleb alone. Exactly the outcome Diane had always intended, and had no idea at all that a receptionist's hurried phone transcription over a year earlier had quietly changed the entire trajectory of what was actually legally true. The second thing Caleb did during those 3 weeks was call Harlan Voss's office directly, not to alert anyone to the actual state of the paperwork, but simply to request a certified copy of the recorded deed sent directly to us, framed as routine record keeping for our own files now that we had a new baby and wanted everything organized. The certified copy arrived within a week, official county seal and all, removing any possible ambiguity or claim later that our own copy had been altered or misunderstood. My mother, when I told her we'd requested it, said simply, "Good girl," in the specific tone she reserves for moments when a case is airtight before it's even been argued. We planned the actual family dinner for a Sunday. The same day of the week, the Whitfields had gathered for 3 years of increasingly loaded conversations about real family land, and Caleb was the one who suggested, deliberately, that we hosted at our house instead of his parents, for the first time in 3 years. Diane, when Caleb called to propose it, sounded genuinely pleased, taking it, I think, as a sign that we were finally coming around to her plan, that hosting the dinner ourselves was some kind of quiet acquiescence to the idea that decisions about the family home ultimately ran through her. She offered to bring a casserole. She asked, with what I now recognize as calculated casualness, whether we'd given any more thought to the living situation, and Caleb told her only that we had a lot to talk about, and that he wanted the whole family there, including his father and his sister Bree, who lived 40 minutes away and rarely made it to these Sunday dinners anymore since her own divorce 2 years earlier. I did not, in that moment, offer her the easy forgiveness that a version of this story with a tittier ending might have called for. I told her, as calmly as I could manage, that I appreciated her saying that, but that an apology wasn't actually the thing I needed most from her right now. What I needed was clarity, going forward, about exactly what role she expected to have in our home and our daughter's life, because I was not willing to raise Eloise in a house where I had to wonder, every time Diane visited, whether she was quietly building a case for why I didn't belong there. That conversation, the actual working out of what came next, took much longer than that single Sunday dinner, and it is, I think, the real heart of this story. Not the moment the deed came out on the table, satisfying as that moment genuinely was, but everything that had to happen afterward, slowly, over the following months, for that family to actually become something safer than it had been before. Weeks after that Sunday dinner were quieter than I expected. In the specific, uneasy way a house goes quiet after a storm has passed through, rather than after it's actually cleared. Diane didn't call for 11 days, the longest stretch of silence from her since Caleb and I had started dating 6 years earlier. And I found myself, more than once during those 11 days, checking my phone with a strange mixture of relief and unease, unsure which version of Diane would eventually surface once she finally did reach out again. When she did call, it was to Caleb first, not to me, which told me something about how she was still processing the whole situation, some old instinct in her, I think, still reaching for her son as the primary relationship in that family, even now. She asked if she could come by, alone, without Gerald, without a casserole this time, just to talk. Caleb asked me before agreeing, which mattered to me more than I think he realized in the moment. And I told him yes, on the condition that whatever conversation happened with me in the room too, not relayed secondhand afterward the way so many important conversations in that family apparently used to happen. Diane came by on a Wednesday afternoon while Eloise napped, and she looked, for the first time since I'd known her, genuinely uncertain of herself, sitting at our kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a mug of tea she didn't really drink. She started by saying she'd spent the previous 2 weeks thinking about her own mother-in-law, a woman named Dorothy who I'd never met, who had died before I entered the family, and who Diane described, haltingly, as a woman who had made her own early marriage a kind of quiet misery through exactly the same courtesy of control over property and money and unspoken rules about whose house it really was. I always told myself I'd never do that to anyone, Diane said, looking down at her tea. And then I sat in that kitchen with the clipboard person for days after you'd had surgery, doing exactly that. I don't have a good explanation for it, Hannah. I think some part of me panicked at the idea of you and Caleb having something that was really, fully yours, in a way I never quite had. And it came out sideways, in the worst possible way. At the worst possible time, I want to be honest that I didn't fully soften in that moment. Even hearing something that sounded like genuine self-reflection for the first time. I told Diane that I appreciated her trying to understand where it came from. But that understanding the root of something doesn't automatically repair the damage it did. And that what I actually needed from her, going forward, was a demonstrated change in behavior over time, not just one honest conversation at my kitchen table. I told her plainly that I needed her to understand, permanently, that this house was mine and Caleb's, legally and otherwise, and that any future disagreement between us as a family needed to be handled through direct conversation. Not through lawyers or property managers or rumors filtered through Gerald. Diane agreed to this, quietly, and I'll admit I didn't fully believe, in that moment, that the agreement would actually hold. What convinced me, slowly, over the following months, wasn't any single dramatic gesture but a series of much smaller ones that accumulated the way trust actually does in real families, rather than the way it does in the tidy version of these stories. Diane started calling ahead before visiting, every single time, something she'd never once done in 3 years of simply showing up whenever she pleased. She stopped making the small correcting comments about how I ran the household that I'd absorbed for years without fully naming them as what they were. When Eloise turned 3 months old, Diane asked, directly, whether it would be alright if she took her for an afternoon so Caleb and I could have a few hours to ourselves. And something about the fact that she asked, plainly, rather than simply assuming the right to it, told me more than any apology could have. Gerald's relationship with Diane, I learned much later through Caleb, went through its own quiet reckoning during those same months, one that neither of them discussed much with us directly. Though Bree filled in some of the details over a lunch we had a few months after that Sunday dinner, Gerald, it turned out, had been far more uneasy about Diane's management of the family land than he'd ever let on over the years. And the deed in Sutton had apparently forced a conversation between them that had been overdue for a very long time, about who actually controlled what in their marriage, and about the ways Diane's need for control had quietly shaped far more of their family's decisions than Gerald had ever fully examined before that Sunday dinner, made it impossible to keep ignoring Bree. For her part, became someone I actually grew close to during those months in a way I never had in the 3 years before Eloise was born. She told me, over that lunch, that she'd left her own marriage 2 years earlier partly because her ex-husband's family had operated on a similar courtesy of unspoken control, and that watching her mother do something so similar to me had forced her to confront some uncomfortable truths about how much of that pattern she'd actually absorbed growing up in that same house. "I used to think Mom just really loved that land," Bree told me. "I didn't understand until I was older that loving land and needing control over the people living on it aren't actually the same thing. Even though they can look almost identical from the outside, I want to tell you that everything resolved neatly. The way it might in a story built for a satisfying ending rather than an honest one. But the truth is more complicated and, I think, more useful to anyone actually living through something like this themselves. Diane and I are not close in the way some mothers and daughters-in-law manage to become. There is still, I think, a permanent wariness between us that no amount of careful behavior over time will ever fully dissolve. The specific kind of wariness that comes from having once heard someone tell you there was no room for you in your own home. 4 days after major surgery, while you held your newborn daughter in your arms. But she is, undeniably, a different mother-in-law now than she was before that Sunday dinner, careful where she used to be presumptuous, asking where she used to simply assume, and genuinely, visibly devoted to Eloise in a way that, whatever else is true about her, I don't believe is performed. Caleb and I did make one more significant decision in the months following that dinner. One I think matters to the actual practical lesson of this whole story. Beyond the satisfaction of the reveal itself, we met with an estate attorney of our own, not connected to the Whitfield family at all, and had a formal, comprehensive review done of every piece of property, every account, every document that touched both our names, making absolutely certain there were no other quiet ambiguities sitting in old paperwork somewhere, waiting to become someone else's leverage during some future difficult moment. We found, in that process, a small life insurance policy from early in our marriage that still listed Diane as a contingent beneficiary from a form Caleb had filled out hastily years earlier and never thought to update. A detail that would have meant nothing at all if our marriage had never faced the kind of test it faced that spring, but which we corrected immediately once we found it, simply because we'd learned, the hard way, exactly how much quiet consequence can live inside paperwork nobody thinks to double-check. Eloise is 8 months old now. She is Caleb's calm temperament and, according to Bree, my exact stubborn expression when she doesn't get her way about something. Diane visits every other Sunday, always calling ahead, always leaving when she says she will. Frank Delgado, no relation to this family, just an old habit of mine mentioning small kindnesses where I find them, actually. I realize I'm mixing up stories in my head at this point, which tells you probably more about how many of these family sagas start to blend together after you've lived through your own than anything else. What I actually mean to say is simply this: the house is still ours. Legally, permanently, unambiguously ours, in exactly the strong, protected form my own mother recognized the significance of 14 months before any of us understood we'd ever need it. I think about that clerical accident often. The receptionist's hurried transcription of a phone message. The single word younger doing so much unplanned work in a sentence that was supposed to protect only Caleb's name and ended up protecting mine instead. I don't know what would have happened to me and Eloise if that error had never occurred. If the deed really had said only Caleb's name, the way Diane always intended. If I'd been standing in that kitchen for days, post-surgery, with genuinely no legal ground to stand on at all beyond whatever goodwill my in-laws chose to extend me in that particular moment. I don't like thinking about that version of the story very much. I think about it anyway, sometimes, late at night, while I'm feeding Eloise. Because I think it's important to actually understand how much of what protected me and my daughter came down to one clerk's imprecise phone transcription rather than anyone's deliberate, generous intention to protect me at all. That's the real lesson I'd want anyone hearing this story to actually take from it, more than the satisfaction of watching Diane's face when the deed came out on that table. Get your name on the paperwork. Ask the uncomfortable question for 10 months before you desperately need the answer. Trust the people who love you to mean what they say. Certainly, but verify it anyway, in writing, recorded with the county. Because the version of your family that loves you in comfortable times is not always the same version you'll be dealing with when things get hard. And the difference between those two versions is very often a single piece of paper that either does or does not have your actual name on it. A question for you before you go. Do you think Hannah should let Diane fully back into her life? Or should she keep her at more of a distance permanently, given what happened? Let me know in the comments. If this story moved you. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more real, emotional stories every week.